Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast Byzantium and Friends. I am Anthony, your host. There is, in what we might call the common culture of North America and Europe, a shared repertoire of imperial architecture. There's the kinds of forms and designs that signal to us that this is an empire. It is a powerful empire. You should respect this empire, or be in awe of us. You know this repertoire. It consists of arches and buildings of a particular type and domes and colonnades and statues on pedestals or on columns and obelisks and things like that. A convenient shorthand showcase for this repertoire is constituted by Washington, D.C., right, which packs all of those elements into a single monumental core that is designed to project imperial power. Now, in a very obvious way, this repertoire alludes to the Roman Empire. And yet the reference is not always direct. So the history of this architectural repertoire is layered. And the later layers, the more recent ones, allude sometimes to the most immediately preceding ones, and not necessarily all the way back to the beginning. So in many ways, Washington, D.C., at the time when it was built, was looking more toward Paris than Rome itself. In turn, it was Paris and the various architectural accessories of the French monarchy and then the Napoleonic imperial phases that looked back to Rome. So similar monumental and architectural genealogies can be constructed even within the broader Roman world, if we include Byzantium. So, for example, in the 13th century, when the Crusaders took over Constantinople and the Romans had to reconstitute their polities in various peripheral centers, well, one of those peripheral centers, at least at Nicaea, which is not far from Constantinople, became the center of a number of refugees and power brokers of the previous Byzantine order, and they reconstituted Nicaea as a kind of little Constantinople in a number of architectural ways, especially with the walls and the churches and so forth. So Nicaea became a kind of little model of Constantinople, quote, in exile. And Constantinople, in turn, right, had been based on Rome to begin with. It was a new Rome. It was a kind of branch office of Rome in the East, back when Constantine had founded it. So in this sense, we can have a little bit of fun with these ideas and imagine Constantinople and Napoleonic Paris as kind of sibling cities, which would make Constantinople the aunt city of Washington, D.C., and so forth. Now, the interesting thing is that Rome itself, as an imperial architectural imaginary, had also been the inheritor of previous imperial styles. In fact, the Romans tended to, pick up and absorb elements from all of the people that they conquered, be they their swords or their type of monument or their literature or the actual people themselves. Right? So Rome kind of sucks everything up into its own orbit and becomes as they called it, cosmopolis, that alludes to all of the prior civilizations that it absorbed. Today, we're going to talk about one of the oldest elements that are embedded in the imperial architectural DNA of the Roman tradition, and this is the Egyptian obelisk, which comes from a much, much more ancient empire, right, that of Egypt in the 2nd millennium BC, especially under the pharaoh Thutmose III. So the Egyptian obelisk, which is not just a merely architectural element, right, but it is a fully formed cultural sign that includes its hieroglyphics and its solar associations, right? So this is one of the oldest elements of this imperial repertoire and koine that survives to this day. I refer you back to Washington, D.C., and if you picture it in your mind, you will realize what is the single most imposing monument there. Not only is there an obelisk, but it is placed in a long open area that, if you see it from space, has the dimensions of a hippodrome. And that is a Roman use of an obelisk, or a Constantinopolitan one, if you will. It's not an Egyptian one. So the obelisk tradition has here been processed and filtered through the Roman tradition before it reached the banks of the Potomac. My guest today is Cecily Hilsdale, professor of art history at McGill University in Canada, Montreal, appearing for the second time on the podcast. You might also want to check out the discussion that I had with her about art and decline and notions of decline in the late Byzantine period, and she's written a fascinating book on that. That, I believe, is one of the most downloaded episodes of this podcast, according to the data that I have access to. By the way, that data also tells me that most of you are in North America or Europe, which is why I've been speaking about this imperial tradition and this repertoire of imperial architecture. I should note that there are parallel paths of imperial architecture that also stem from ancient Near East and Greece and Rome, but that have a trajectory that heads toward the East and fuses with later Muslim and Persian traditions and results in a different koine. That would be a separate discussion. But I just wanted to note that not all traditions go from Egypt to Washington. They also go eastward as well. Anyway, so back to Cecily. So she's written a fascinating chapter in a volume on the topic of the obelisk. In fact, she calls it the Inter-Imperial Obelisk in Istanbul. So focusing on the one in Constantinople, but not exclusively. The title of the article is Imperial Monumentalism, Ceremony, and Forms of Pageantry. So today we're going to unpack the complex symbolism and the long history of the imperial use of obelisks in rituals and in imperial performances and ideology. And I had a lot of fun with this discussion. Who doesn't like obelisks? I mean, come on. Thanks again to medievalist.net for reposting these episodes. And so without any further delay, here's my conversation with Cecily Hilsdale. Hello, Cecily. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here today.
So, obelisks, right? I mean, it's the apex predator of architectural bling. Like, really, they're practically completely useless, right? Like, you can't do anything with an obelisk. You can't interact with it in any way. It's just there to dominate the landscape.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, even a Roman arch, you can go through it. You can use it as a gate, I guess. But obelisks are just anyway. But here's the interesting thing. I have the sense that that's because of the way the Romans used the obelisks, and every other culture that is imitating the Romans, like modern Rome and France and the United States, where the obelisk is placed in a large empty area, a large empty space, in order to dominate it, like to focus all the attention on it. Whereas in the Egyptian context, like they put them up against the wall of the pylon or something. Like maybe its tip would protrude, on top. But it wasn't like, everybody look at the obelisk. It was just one other thing in them. Anyway, is that right?
It's true that I think, later instantiations of obelisks, you're right, they do separate the obelisk from everything else, which in fact makes them even more imposing.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that the power of the obelisk is the fact that it is imposing, right? That it is it dwarfs the human body, like the scale, right? This is really about scale. So you're right, in ancient Egypt, it was part of a whole kind of spatial logic of a temple complex. It was much more integrated into it, but it was the highest point. So there was still, in terms of marking a skyline from a distance, like it was still this kind of dominating marker. But you're right, it wasn't the focal point. I think that that's what you're getting at. And that is a real difference. I hadn't really thought about that. But yeah, the wide open piazza around an obelisk that focus all the energy on it. That wasn't the same in ancient Egypt. You're right.
Yeah, there's like a huge pylon right behind it, and probably some massive statues, and who knows what else. So, what is an obelisk in the Egyptian context?
Yeah, in the ancient context, ancient Egyptian contexts, obelisks were intimately tied to conceptions of solar kingship and kind of royal renewal, of the renewal of the pharaoh. So, in some sense, as you were saying, they marked ceremonial spaces. And these spaces that they marked, these temple complexes, were the spaces that were thought through ceremonial actions to reinvest the pharaoh with this kind of sacral aura. So they're intimately tied with royal rule and with royal charisma in ancient Egypt. And so, while the history of the obelisk as a form goes way, way, way back, it's really with the pharaohs of New Kingdom Egypt, so kind of the 18th and 19th dynasties, that we really see the proliferation of obelisks. We really start to see a lot of them. They're installed in temple precincts, often in pairs, but sometimes as a solo obelisk. And they really marked out the topography of the site. But as you know, along with a lot of other stuff, right? So obelisks, monumental statuary, great pylons that kind of interlocked throughout a temple. The way I always think about obelisks that makes sense to me is that they are monumental punctuation for a site. And especially as anchors for ceremonial actions that took place in the site. And so those are the two words that really always are in my mind about obelisks: punctuation and anchors, right? They're anchors for ceremonial, and they punctuate the landscape, right? You could see them from a great distance, etc. And, in most contexts, certainly in ancient Egypt, they were conceived as part of these monumentalized performances of royal ritual, of kind of ceremonial renewal. For example, at the great Theban complexes, these were the sites of royal renewal, royal ritual, and center kind of larger festivals, cycles of ceremonial. I won't go into detail, but there's this aspect that I really find compelling about obelisks is that they're these obdurate, enduring, difficult objects. And yet the way they anchored the space, all these spaces were for ceremonial that had different timescales attached to them, different notions of time and performances of time. So, for example, in the Theban complexes, there were daily rituals that happened in the complexes, right? There's something like 36 daily rituals described in the papyri and on the temple walls, kind of offering libations to cult statues. So kind of a daily cycle. Then there's also an annual cycle, the Opet festival, where cult statues were processed in and out of the different temples. It's kind of a more civic and consensual dimension, communal role. And then there were also more what's known as the Sed or the Hempstead festival, which was a festival that really marked the anniversary of a pharaoh's rule. And it was meant to kind of reinvest the king's potency kind of on the anniversary of the rule. So like after something like 30 years, they would have their first, and then more frequently after that. And that was also, processions, a ritual running, and all these ceremonials that meant to kind of reinvest the dynamism of the ruler. But what's interesting, I think, is that the spaces that all of these different rituals took place in, with these different timescales or kind of temporal ways of thinking, were marked by these monumental punctuation marks, right? Like these permanent obelisks. So this idea that I find most compelling is that ritual or ceremonial, which was performed, repeatedly in time and over time in different ways, was anchored and commemorated by these singular monuments that were designed to endure through time. So again, it's this correspondence between performances that are kind of ephemeral or cyclical, designed for reinvigoration of the rule, between that and this kind of idea of monumental commemoration, kind of historic preservation, right? I think that those two ways of thought really coalesce around the obelisk, and I think that's what I find most interesting about obelisks in ancient Egypt, are these temporal registers that they anchor.
Yeah, they do have sometimes commemorative inscriptions on them.
Oh yeah,
hieroglyphic. And
yeah, so that's actually, that's the key here, is that as markers, they are actually historical, right? Yeah. So they are, they are dedicated and associated with particular rules. They're not just like general markers. They celebrate a pharaoh's rule. They underscore genealogy. The hieroglyphics often will map out a pharaoh's terrain, right? So we can think of Hatshepsut's pharaoh, or her, when she was pharaoh, the obelisk that she dedicated. The texts will describe the limits of the land, under her sandal, and link the material properties of the obelisk itself with her rule, with sovereignty. The glimmering electrum at the top, which shone in the sun, was the best of all foreign lands, measured by the gallon like sacks of grain. They talk about the feat of engineering to make this monolithic obelisk, boasting that it took, a single seamless block took 7 months of quarry work. So there's a lot of really specific historic information that we have, that the obelisks preserve, about particular moments, about particular rulers. Like, they are kind of historical documents, not just kind of general markers of the terrain. They really embody power, right? They make power felt in really palpable ways because of their scale, right? Yeah. This idea that, whether or not you could read what the hieroglyphs are saying, you feel the power, right? Because of this kind of manufacture that, the scale of something like that boggles the mind. And, so there is something about it that's beyond just what's said on the obelisk.
Right. So I had read that the shape of the obelisk is meant to represent a sunbeam coming down, right? That it kind of expands a little bit at the top, and then it shoots down, and it, flares a little bit like something from a light source. And either the tip was encased in some sort of metal, or there was some sort of metallic orb at the top that sort of represented the sun. Mm-hmm. And even in Constantinople and Rome, where they were moved later, they kept like this. I think it's described. Is it an Ammianus? I don't know. Is a kind of pineapple shape.
It's a pine cone.
A pine cone. Yes.
Not a pineapple. Pine cone.
I'm sorry. Yeah. I thought pineapple was a bit funnier.
It would have been better if it's a pineapple.
Now I'm reminded of the Discworld song, the wizard's staff has a knob at the end. Okay, sorry. So this power was obviously felt by the Roman emperors and subsequently all of these European colonial regimes, Washington, D.C. and so forth. So there was a export of obelisks from Egypt to, where Constantinople. There's one in the hippodrome. There's one authentic Egyptian obelisk in the hippodrome by Thutmose III. This is the son of Hatshepsut you just mentioned. There's a built obelisk right next to it, which is not from Egypt. It's just which I think was encased in like bronze sheets so that you wouldn't be able to see, what it was. But then there's a whole number of them in Rome and Paris and so forth. So why the export of obelisks, and like how many were taken, or roughly do we know?
Most of them, very few are still in Egypt. Thutmose III really raised a lot of obelisks. He raised 7 obelisks, and 4 of them survive. 2 of them were installed in Thebes, and they, in antiquity, moved to Rome and New Rome, right? And we'll talk more about them. And they were definitely part of a larger project, kind of imperial campaign that harnessed the symbolic power of commemorative monoliths in ancient Egypt. But even aside from those, 2 of the other obelisks of Thutmose III, which were installed in Heliopolis, They moved in the 19th century to New York and London. Yeah. And so this isn't just an ancient movement. This is very much, a modern movement as well. Egyptomania is certainly part of it. But I think that the larger part of the story of the kind of itinerant obelisk, I think, comes back to the idea of power itself and how power is manifested. And so the technical prowess associated with quarrying and erecting these immense obelisks in Egypt is matched, if not exceeded, by the expertise necessary to deinstall them without breaking them, transport them great distances, and then reinstall them in new spaces. And so I think that the movement of the obelisks, it's really about technological mastery of Egypt. Right. I mean, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. In the movement of the obelisks to all these different places, yes, Paris, London, New York, Constantinople, Rome has tons. In these movements, we lose a sense of specificity of their original context in Egypt. Which pharaoh, what sanctuary, right? These were historical markers. So you lose the grain of texture of history. And I think the obelisks come to embody the idea of Egypt as a great empire of the past, right? So they become a marker, I think, of kind of time itself and a marker of antiquity itself. They become, in some sense, a monumental measure of the distance between the past and the present. So I think they really, in their movement, they come to signify different things.
As you write, once Augustus transported at least one. Two. And with a monumental complex he put them in, we'll talk about that in a moment. Yeah. And when Roman hippodromes were almost like required to have an obelisk, and if they had two, this was like super special, and like Rome and Constantinople have two, then, and this is the argument that you make, it's not clear whether subsequent appropriations of obelisks or imitations of obelisks are alluding back to Egypt or to Imperial Rome. Like it's more like Rome now sets the standard for how you use obelisks and why you need them and what you do with them. And exactly. Yeah. So let's talk about what Augustus did with his obelisks in Rome. So he had a whole complex. Can you tell us a little bit what that was designed to do?
Yeah. I mean, he brought two obelisks, and each of them were faced with identical Latin inscriptions, which mention Augustus, son of divine Caesar, and it mentions dedicating them to the sun. And I quote, "When Egypt had been brought under the sway of the Roman people." And so this inscription, I think, on these obelisks really encapsulates what they meant for Augustan Rome, that there is this way in which the obelisks are kind of a metonym for the fallen empire, for the Roman conquest of Egypt. So really the idea of subjugation and kind of spoils, being taken by the victor is certainly implied by those inscriptions. And really the idea of the kind of subjugation of Egypt, of course, was key to the Augustan period in a sense of really of historicity in early imperial Rome. The inscription also indicates certain parallelisms, and I think that's super interesting that you have, these spoils of war in these two different cultures, but there are a lot of connections still in terms of symbols. So the idea that in both contexts, there's a solar association, right? That these are dedicated to the sun. And that many of the obelisks themselves in their Egyptian context were victory monuments against other peoples. So, and that's basically what Augustus is doing in taking these obelisks as well. So there is some parallelism between them. So the first one was installed at the center of the Circus Maximus. It was later excavated, like most of the obelisks in Rome, starting in the late 16th century. They were all kind of excavated and recurated around the city. So they're not in their original space now, but there was, he did set one up in the Circus Maximus. And in the circus, it kind of participated in this wider celestial analogy of the circus. So its central position was akin to the position of the sun, where, you can think of the chariots as heavenly bodies racing cyclically around the sun. So there's a lot of the kind of symbolism of the racetrack and the obelisk in the circus in Rome, which will be the same in Constantinople as well. But the other obelisk does something kind of crazy, and this has to do with the building program, the larger renovations of the Campus Martius area of Rome, which really had deep symbolism going back to the foundation of Rome, Romulus and Remus, last Etruscan king. And this other obelisk that Augustus brought was installed as the pointer of a massive solar meridian. So this would cast its shadow on the ground on a meridian line and chart the progress of the sun. So the pavement had a meridian line inlaid with golden markers. And by measuring the shadow that, again, was cast by the Egyptian obelisk pointer daily on this pavement, you could kind of track the local time at noon, indicate true north, and really check the congruence of civic and solar calendars. And there's so much literature on this. It's hard to do justice to it in a brief conversation, but the significance of this is interesting because this really phenomenal installation tells us a lot about the kind of cosmic scale of the imperial agenda here, particular to Augustus. So when he became Pontifex Maximus, he took on the responsibility of the Roman calendar and had it recalibrated. And I think that this large scale solar meridian really showed in clearly legible terms this harmony with the progress of the sun and the year, and showcased Augustus's priestly role as kind of a symbolic timekeeper.
Right. Cosmic
and
timekeeper.
by extension, yeah, and like order maker, right? And so using this visually arresting and immense monument from the past, and one with particular resonances of Roman ascendancy over Egypt, this monument then becomes not just about marking place, but really literally about setting time. And there's some great literature on this. I think Peter Heslin's work is fantastic on the idea of the temporal order here. Yeah.
And it worked. I mean, we still use the Roman calendar. We have a month named after him, right? I mean, it's phenomenal how deeply entrenched these imperial orders of time. Augustus is a cosmic timekeeper, not normally how we think of him, right? But especially if you're a historian looking at his career, he looks somewhat different. But yeah, he did leave that behind. And I should say the cosmic symbolism of the hippodrome, there are some ancient authors who elaborate that in great detail, right? Like the colors of the racing teams are the four seasons, and the bits at the end of the track represent the different phases of the moon or whatever. Yeah. It's like really, really elaborate.
Yeah.
And having this solar monument in the middle. Now, some might think this sort of conflicts with ancient theories of geocentrism, but actually there were contexts in which the sun was placed symbolically in the center of the universe, and this was one of them. Anyway, and that whole symbology was transferred over to Constantinople when the hippodrome was built. They sort of accompanied the Roman hippodrome as it was exported to all the cities in the East. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the obelisk, the authentic Egyptian obelisk in the hippodrome in Constantinople, and so who, when, why, and so forth?
Sounds like a pretty straightforward question, but it's not. I mean, we do know the basics that in the late 4th century, under Theodosius, the obelisk gets raised in the hippodrome. But in order to understand how that happens, we really have to go back to Constantine, and we have to think about the relationship between New Rome and Old Rome. So again, as you mentioned earlier, in some sense in Constantinople, the obelisk was less about Constantinople and Egypt and more about Constantinople and Rome. So when Constantine the Great, when he was involved in having this massive obelisk of Thutmose III, the largest one at Karnak, dismantled from its site and shipped down the Nile to Alexandria to wait the construction of a special ship to transport it to its likely destination, which would have been Constantinople. He died before it reached its destination, and it kind of languished in Alexandria, and then his son had it moved instead to Rome. And this is in 357 as part of a month-long triumphal visit there. But The question about whether Constantine actually intended that obelisk to be for Rome or for Constantinople requires a little bit of qualifications. Our sources are not really clear about this. One of our sources says it actually was meant to go to Rome. But I think, most scholars, and following Jonathan Bartle here, who's really made a clear case that the idea of the largest obelisk from Thebes going to Constantinople really does fit with a Constantinian agenda, right? Yeah. This seems totally Constantinian. It seems like a no-brainer that this large obelisk was part of the plan for Constantinople. What I'm suggesting is that the idea of this obelisk for the hippodrome of Constantinople, we really should see it as a Constantinian conception, but the execution was Theodosian. It was under Theodosius that it actually came to its place. Now, it was installed at the center of the hippodrome. So just like the Circus of Rome, it finds its place at the Circus of Constantinople, standing there still today, unlike the rest of the monuments, the obelisks in Rome. And again, the precise circumstances of its arrival are a bit unclear. We know that it had been in the city for some time already before it was actually erected on the hippodrome in 390. What I find compelling about the early history of the obelisk is that we don't have external sources describing its transport or arrival. We don't have historians elaborating on it. There is a reference to Emperor Julian requesting an obelisk that had been lying on the beaches of Alexandria, and that's in 362, but not much else. There's really not a lot of references to it before it actually gets to the hippodrome. But interesting part here is that our real evidence for it is the monument itself. Again, so the inscriptions, allow us to trace where it came from, and then the base itself, which we can talk about, does both textually and visually describe the circumstances of its installation on the hippodrome. And so it's just a wonderful monument that, we don't have stories about it. It tells us about its history in interesting ways. And I think that in thinking of the who, what, where, and why, I'm interested in how we know what we know about it, which is really the monument itself.
Yeah, I'm reminded what you said earlier, that the transport of such a thing is itself a reflection of the power of the imperial regime that's doing it. It requires special ships, very specialized, not so much a work crew. I imagine they use, workers, from other kinds of projects, but the technique involved in raising an obelisk and putting it on a marble stand that you've designated for it, right? And if I remember correctly, this one broke.
Oh yeah.
And the bottom third broke off. And so they had to adjust the base for a slightly narrower, right, surface.
Yeah. Yeah, and I should say that that's the great irony here is that the marble base of the obelisk, which is like this amazing work of art, and it owes its existence to the accident that they actually broke the obelisk. So they had to kind of make this base to fill in the space. And that's why we have like our greatest public monument of the Theodosian period. Yeah.
And the base, or rather the base of the base, right? So the base, what we call the base is this Borg cube that depicts Theodosius on all four sides. And it rests on the original base, presumably. And that original base has the epigrams, the Latin one facing the Imperial Box, the Greek one facing the stands on the other side that sort of talk about the erection of the obelisk by Theodosius and his city prefect, who was Proculus at the time. But by the way, it's interesting that Theodosius was in Rome while this was happening. He was putting down one of those Western rival emperors. And then underneath the base, it depicts a scene of racing in the hippodrome itself, so it's very meta. And on the other side, it depicts the whole process of installation with the ropes and the workers and the whatever sled they had to drag that thing and all of that. So it's very, very self-referential and pointing to the process of its erection.
Yeah. And, in the process of doing it, and that's something I've thought a lot about, there's the obsession with the technology, because like, let's face it, that was a serious feat, right?
Mm.
It was not, and the inscriptions really call it, a reluctant installation, right? It was hard to do. Like, there's a real self-consciousness about how difficult this was, both visually and in terms of the text itself, of the inscription itself. There's an acknowledgement of the challenges of raising the obelisk. But you kind of zoom out, in adding all that extra information on the base, it's actually framing the obelisk in a different way. It's making the obelisk kind of framed around Roman technology and around Roman triumph. It's installing the obelisk, but it's also conceptually reinstalling the obelisk, making it a victory monument, a Theodosian victory monument, more than Thutmose's victory monument. So there's a way in which it's all of the kind of meta about the base, is interesting in and of itself, but it also does point to the way that I think the obelisk, in its Constantinopolitan context, is becoming framed and foregrounded around Theodosian power, not pharaonic power.
Yeah. How do you imagine the obelisk interacting with the kinds of events, and I'm thinking more ceremonial than the races that were taking place in the hippodrome?
I mean, the hippodrome obviously had the races. It also had, distributions of largesse, but it also was the site of imperial encounter. Is that kind of what we're thinking of here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ceremonial.
The ceremonial dimensions of the hippodrome are really important. It's true. This was a site for the games, for the races, entertainments, and all of that associated with consuls, with emperors. But it also was the place of imperial encounter. And I think that that's important because the base of the obelisk has images of the emperor. This is a pharaonic monument, but the site of the hippodrome, with its allusions to old Rome, it really was the main site for the people of Constantinople to actually encounter their emperor face to face, where he was acclaimed, where he was visually presented as emperor. And because of these imperial associations of the site, the hippodrome itself provided kind of an optimal venue for military triumphs, spectacles performed for foreign embassies, receptions. So it wasn't just the site to proclaim power, which it indeed was, but it was also the site to test power. So of course, the most famous is the Nika revolts, right? Starting in the hippodrome and also brutally suppressed in the hippodrome, right? So this was also the site for, ritual executions, where these monuments of victory, dotting the landscape of the hippodrome, would be this backdrop for gruesome events. So, there's a way in which I think the hippodrome is this site that's very much associated with the rising of the emperor to the kathisma and all of the solar imagery of that. But it's also the site of contest, of tension in imperial, in kind of the contours of imperial office and imperial power. So I think it's a site that's a little bit of both. And I think that
I like how you mentioned the ceremonial entrance of the emperor into his box in the hippodrome. And by the way, the Imperial Box in the hippodrome was a building in itself.
Yeah.
Don't imagine something from like a Mozart house, sort of addressing the audience here. It was like a 3-story building with a dome and its own mosaics and all kinds of things inside. On the top, it was open for the emperor and his guests to view the games and be seen by the crowds. Yeah. And when the emperor appeared there, the crowds would shout, anatilon, which is a verb that refers to the rising of the sun in the east, from where we get like Anatolia from. And the interesting thing is that the palace is to the east of the hippodrome. So the emperor's coming from the east, and he's rising up, and everybody is acclaiming him that way. This is on a good day, right? The emperor's having a good day in Constantinople. You never know with the crowd. So what I like to imagine is when the sun, the actual sun, not the emperor, but as sun king, but the actual sun appears over the hills on the Asian side of the Bosporus in the morning, the first things that its rays would hit, and this is in Theodosian Constantinople, before Hagia Sophia and Justinian put himself first in line there, would have been the colossal statue of Constantine on top of his column in the Forum of Constantine. Right now, that's slightly higher up because the ground rises, from the hippodrome as you go to the Forum of Constantine. And the column itself was 37 meters, something like that, and colossal statue on top, maybe 6 meters or more tall, gilded. So that would have been the first thing that would just shine in the sky, as even before, right? Like the people on the street saw the sun, they'd see that thing flashing, and the tip of the obelisk, right? If it had the knob at the end.
So there's two obelisks,
right,
at the hippodrome, okay? And so you've got the what's called the built obelisk or the masonry obelisk, which would have originally been sheathed in bronze.
Boy.
So this is really, I think, when we think about the sun rising, and I love the symbolism of, like, say before the games, on the day before the games, where the emperor is going to go to the kathisma, the chanting of the crowd saying "Rise, rise" starts before the emperor comes into view, right? And so there's this oral kind of invitation, let's say, to the emperor to rise like the sun, and rising up and from the east like the sun from the palace. I mean, the kathisma is sometimes called the kind of like the rose garden of the palace, that this was the public face of the palace. There's that kind of performative rising, which is very clearly mapping the body of the emperor with the sun, for sure. But yeah, in terms of the kind of solar exploitation of monuments, you've got the two obelisks, you've got the statue of Constantine. But you're very right, like, to think about this before Hagia Sophia in terms of what these high points would be that would be catching the sun. I think that's a really good point. I think some people are doing really experimenting with modeling and kind of reimagining Constantinople in different historical moments, which monuments would be there and not there, and what kind of sight lines there would be. So some people are doing some of this research that's really interesting, because you do have to kind of always think, well, what was visible and what wasn't at that moment? You have to have that historic specificity. The hippodrome itself, there was the Thutmose III's Egyptian obelisk, but there also was this built obelisk that is made of masonry blocks, but you wouldn't have known that at the time because it would have been completely sheathed in bronze. So there would have been this enormous bronze monument next to the original, or not the original, next to the authentic Egyptian obelisk, and those would be the two kind of solar monuments.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to go near that on a hot day. No, I'm also intrigued at the hieroglyphic aspect.
Yeah,
because the Thutmose's obelisk has hieroglyphs on all four sides. The interesting thing is that the sort of the pharaonic cartouche side of the monument is the one facing the Imperial Box. Which, okay, there's a 1 in 4 chance that's random. I mean, it's right that they got it right if it's random,
right?
Or else somebody knew that, like they had some kind of Egyptian expert. And I think this is the decade, the 390s, from which we have the last known dated hieroglyphic inscription in Egypt. So this is the decade when actual reading knowledge of hieroglyphics goes extinct, or soon thereafter. In the 5th century, we start having these like Neoplatonic treatises on hieroglyphs written in Egypt that are just complete bogus.
Right.
So it's possible that they had some actual Egyptian, knowledge and lore brought here. And I was fascinated by the fact that the little miniature obelisk that's depicted on the base about to be erected, it also has little miniature hieroglyphics carved on it, like imitating, like those are like our only specimen of actual native Constantinopolitan Egyptian hieroglyphs. It's sort of weird. Anyway,
and they're done really well. I mean, the artist did a really good job. There's a very close correspondence between the rendering of the hieroglyphs in marble on the lower base with the order of the hieroglyphs on the obelisk itself. So there's an interesting play there between those, for sure. I mean,
they're very eroded now. Because of air pollution and all kinds of things. But I think based on photographs from the early 20th century, I think someone had proposed that the hieroglyphs on the base refer to the gods. Like that's what it reads. It's a reference to the gods, which is interesting because the city prefect Proclus, who raised this, he was a pagan, and his father was pagan too, and they were soon executed there was some political turmoil. And I was just kind of wondering if they're getting some little pagan wedge into the Theodosian regime via Egyptian hieroglyphs. His father Tatianos, he had actually been a governor in Egypt in the past. So yeah, I've tracked these guys down to see what they had been up to.
I mean, if you hadn't done the research, I might start to think that you are really into conspiracy theories.
Well, let me tell you about the international ring. Yes.
I mean, look, I don't really, all I know about the knowledge of hieroglyphics in the 5th century is what I know from you. It's hard to know what the actual knowledge of hieroglyphs, like what actually was known about the hieroglyphs on it. But legibility, there's two different ways of thinking about legibility. Like literally, yeah, I don't know who knew what they said, but the idea of hieroglyphs themselves as being recognized as this numinous kind of sacred characters that had meaning. I mean, people, if they couldn't read it, they knew what it was, right? That this was this sacred writing of Egypt. So I think that there's those two levels of legibility that are, we can't forget about the other, the more kind of symbolic one.
Oh, absolutely. Hieroglyphs, probably more than any other script in history, has attracted mystics and symbolic readings and all kinds of things. And this period is no exception. Like I said, the Platonists are, making hay of all this stuff. I don't know that they could, who could read it or anything like that. And besides, the cartouche can be identified even if you can't actually read, what it's saying.
Right.
What about the figures on the base? This quadruple representation of Theodosius in his Imperial Box.
Yeah.
What do you make of that?
It's so interesting that in other conversations we've talked about these as kind of normative templates. And I love that phrase, that the imagery of the base kind of serves as this normative templates. What I think is the base itself has these 4 sides, shows the emperor in the kathisma, flanked by the imperial household, administration, military. It's kind of a lithic epiphany, if you will. And I think that the idea that this is the center of the hippodrome, opposite where the emperor actually appeared in the kathisma, this is kind of the marble version of the performance that would have happened. And so this relationship between, again, the performative dimensions of what actually happened in the hippodrome and the monument itself, the permanent marker, is really interesting. And there's the temporal relationship between these two, right? There's certain portions of it that are very historical, right? The lower base with the raising of the obelisk. But then the faces of the emperor on all 4 sides are strangely generic. There's something strangely, there's this stilled, hieratic look for all of them. It's really less about a particular moment and more about this kind of spectacular quality of looking at the emperor. In one of them, he's holding the wreath. So there are differences on all 4 sides, but despite those compositional differences, the overall look is really quite static and similar across the 4. But there is a difference between them that hinges on which side of the hippodrome they face, right? So where you were sitting in the hippodrome and what you saw actually does condition the imagery in really interesting ways. And in part, in order to understand, I actually think the language of the inscriptions and the inscriptions themselves help orient which side faces what audience. So really, we're talking about the position of the base in relationship to its expected original audience. So the dedicatory inscriptions are both in Greek and Latin. The Latin inscription, which was, in the 5th century, the language of the court, bureaucracy, military spheres, the law, that side of the inscription faces the kathisma. And then on the other side, which faces the kind of the populace, it's in Greek, which again, this kind of lingua franca of the people, which of course complemented the more polyglot culture of Constantinople, but that was what faced the people. So there's a language description, but that the inscriptions aren't just a bilingual rendering of the same text. They actually tell their story quite differently. And how many times people walking through the hippodrome just assume that it's the same thing that it says. It does give the same basic information, right? It says, that this was erected by Theodosius with Proclus and the amount of time, but there's differences between the two. So the Greek side gives kind of a very basic information. It's much shorter, it's all positive, it's kind of generic. But the Latin inscription, which again faces the Kathisma, gives more detail. It tells a much more nuanced story of factionalism and of Theodosian triumph. It's also written in the voice of the obelisk.
Right, first person.
I love that, right? Yes. I was ordered to obey the masters after the tyrants had been extinguished or whatever. Yes. I was conquered and mastered in 30 days. So there's this really, I think the fact that it's a first person account of the obelisk and that's facing the Kathisma, really, really interesting. It turns the obelisk into a victory monument, right? Because it's referring to a suppressed coup by Theodosius at the time. And so in doing that, it's really becoming a victory monument, right? Where Theodosius's conquering of the obelisk is akin to his conquering of the tyrants, of this unsuccessful coup of his rivals, becoming a Theodosian victory monument that then allows the Theodosians to continue, right? And this is, of course, plainly advertised again on the Kathisma facing side. And, Linda Safran has a great article about this, pointing out that, in its original configuration, like you didn't exactly change seats in the hippodrome, right? You didn't, it's not like all of a sudden one day they're going to bring on the people that are going to sit on the Kathisma side and switch them the other day. Like these were really set subject positions, right? No one else sat, it was the imperial administration that sat on the Kathisma side, that this was distinct, right?
That's actually one of my favorite articles. I read it, I think when I was an undergraduate or thereabouts. And it was eye-opening to me. I didn't know until that point that you could look at monuments that way, that you could read them within their overall spatial environment and say who can see what and from what side and so forth. And it was really eye-opening. And once you start thinking along those lines, there's no end to it. Like, just imagine. So the monument itself is speaking in the first person to Theodosius, like he's addressed, because he's, the inscription is pointing toward the Imperial Box. And on the other hand, you have Theodosius in his Imperial Box, looking out onto the hippodrome, seeing Theodosius in his Imperial Box, right, depicted on the base of the obelisk. Okay, Cecily, we're almost at an hour's time, so we should wrap this up. But I was wondering if you could leave us with another sort of interesting example of how these monuments interact with their audiences, especially the Theodosian obelisk base.
I mean, and this is really my interest in obelisks, has to do with these juxtapositions of temporal modes and models, right? This idea of ceremonies that are performed around them and that they're anchored by them and that change over time, right? So certainly the placement of, the inscriptions and other details in the original setting are very much mark the whole monument as this kind of Theodosian project and Theodosian victory. But it also kind of served as a template later on. And as things change, right? This is the site changes, the administration changes, and the kind of what I think one might once have thought of as an afterlife, but I think it's actually more appropriate to think of a kind of continued life of the obelisk. It does kind of shape certain aspects later on. So I wanted to kind of briefly mention this, this is probably a good way to close, about this distinction between the two faces of the marble base facing the Kathisma and facing the people, and the way that that particular reading of the difference between the two, not the inscriptions, but the pictorial imagery that Matt Canepa actually made in his wonderful book. The fact that the face that faces the the people shows these vanquished barbarians kneeling before the emperor and offer tribute. And this is, of course, a stock iconographic theme in the repertoire of victory. We have a lot of images of that, and relates also to what happened in the space. Primary sources stress the importance of tribute and diplomatic gifts. They were enumerated, appraised, and displayed. Some were even paraded through the hippodrome, right? So there is this idea of presenting gifts to the emperor would have been ceremonial, really relevant. And so later in the 6th century, when the emperor hosted a delegation of Sasanians, Canepa argues that this image that faced the people kind of served as this encrypted image of triumph. And encrypted because the kneeling barbarians were positioned on the face that, the people saw, but that the people in the Kathisma did not see, which is, of course, where the Sasanian delegation would have been. And so the people opposite the Kathisma would see the Imperial Box and the delegates, but see that framed by this lithic image of barbarians subjugating themselves in front of the emperor. So it, as a kind of frame for contemporary ceremonial and diplomatic practice that, again, was not the original intention of the obelisk base, but the obelisk base just kind of presented this wonderful opportunity that was capitalized on, centuries later, and still did later still. I mean, it became an important site for Ottoman ceremonial later, and it really did have this life that continued on and shaped ceremonial practices in later periods.
Yeah, I love that reading too. The emperor might be honoring all these foreign dignitaries in the Imperial Box because we know that they were taken to see the games and the entertainments and the dancing girls and the organs that were playing and all of the bear shows and all of this.
Yeah.
And yet the people on the other side of the hippodrome, not the dignitaries in the box, had this sort of their own secret message for what the actual relationship was. Like, what's going on here. It's not what you see, it's what you see on the base of the obelisk.
And it's so very Byzantine to have something that, it really, when you first visit the hippodrome and you see the obelisk base, you're like, oh yeah, there's 4 images of the emperor, all right. But then it's like you look a little closer and you're like, oh, how come there's dancing girls on one side and kneeling barbarians on the other? And so it's this close looking that is not immediately apparent, but it kind of, the more you look, the more you unpack encoded messages.
That's why I love the idea of Proclus putting a hieroglyphic hymn to the gods on the mini obelisk depicted on the base of the big Anyway, okay.
Yeah.
Great. I love this chapter that you wrote. Thank you. Because again, obelisks might be architecturally pretty useless, but I think that we've shown that they do so much work in the symbolic realm. They're really amazing.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, and for coming on.
My pleasure.